Hey everyone, it's ACPL here. If you didn't know, my main shtick is RuneScape art. I'm part of the RuneScape art community, and if you'd like to see some of my work, go check out my Reddit, Instagram, and Twitter. Now, I thought it would be fun to talk about some of the visual design in RuneScape, specifically combat. Now, but what do I mean by visual design? I'm talking specifically like how a combat style feels, like thematics, identity, and the progression of it aesthetically. For example, when you think of a traditional wizard, you're probably thinking about magical wands and staffs, long flowy robes and beards, pointy hats, you know what I'm saying? And RuneScape sometimes takes a different approach to things, which makes things interesting. So to start this off, let's talk about Melee's visual design. First off, what are the defining traits that separates tank versus power melee armor? This is probably the easiest among the combat styles to distinguish. You know, with tank armor, it's bulky, it looks hard, and you're fully plated. Like, it's expected, right? And then when you look at something like the Acto Terralith armor, it legit looks like there's something from the side of a cliff. It's massive, it's bulky, and you're not going to get through that. Now, when it comes to power armor, it's an entirely different story. From my perspective, the defining characteristics for power armor is that they have a lot more spikes and they have a lot more mobility. We see that with armor like Bandos, Malevolent, and the Vestments of Havoc, right? However, I do want to note that there are of course going to be armors that don't fall into these characteristics. For example, the Barrows armors. They all have spikes, they all have gaps for mobility, and they all provide offensive effects, save except for Guthan's. In that sense, the Barrows armor should be power armor, but they're not. They're tank armor. Likewise, we see armors such as Torva and Masterwork. Those are fully plated armor sets, yet they're classified as power armor. Masterwork in particular, like, that stuff looks bulky as hell, but nevertheless, it's a power armor. So there are definitely discrepancies when it comes to characteristics of tank and power armor, but despite that, it's still fairly easy to lay them all out and see like the dividing line when it comes to it. What makes something tanky versus what makes something powerful in melee. Now, the progression of melee equipment is pretty interesting. And when I talk about progression, I'm talking about as the gear gets higher and higher, a theme starts to become more apparent. With melee, you start off wearing regular armor, you know, bronze, iron, and steel. These things are normal and are natural. However, when you start progressing upwards, as the gear gets higher and higher, the theme surrounding melee becomes a lot more darker. The Barrows equipment, for example, it's stuff that we grave rob from the dead. Necronium has this giant menacing skull smack down in the middle of the chest plate. Dragon armor, you have teeth and horns going on, and there's also the fact that this is forged from metal from an entirely different timeline. It's ancient and it's beyond our regular knowledge. Then you have something like Bandos armor. It's the armor of a brute and savage, right? Like General Grador and the Bendosians in general, they're all about savagery. They're all about war and fighting. So you can start to see that a darker theme is growing as you progress in melee equipment. And continuing on, you got like Torva armor, which itself doesn't look too menacing, but the lore surrounding it is. This is melee gear from a bygone era, worn by soldiers who serve the ancient god Zeros. And Zeros, he's not necessarily known for his benevolence, so you can fill in some gaps there. And then you got Malevolent armor, which the theme is literally in its name, Malevolent. You know, it's made out of malevolent energy, which is anguish and malice made manifest. Then you have something like the Masterwork, which is an outlier again. Masterwork doesn't scream evil, so yeah, but you can add spikes to it. And then finally, at the very end, we have the Vestments of Havoc. I've said this before in my redesigning the Vestments of Havoc video, go check it out. But vestments in general are meant to be these pristine and holy robes worn by priests. But here we're seeing the complete opposite. You know, it's blasphemous and evil. These are being worn by war priests who serve RuneScape's version of literal Satan, Zamorak. So the progression of melee gets pretty dark. And this leads me to my next point, which is like the overarching theme of melee, or the identity, I guess. As we've seen, as melee progresses, it becomes more abnormal. It starts to becoming something that's foreign and savage and also evil. Like you're using armor that comes from and draws power from dark places. Not only that, but if you also take into account the types of abilities used by melee, you know, you got Slaughter, Dismember, Massacre. Bleeds are a big part of the style. And it's not something that is like a pretty picture when you think about it. There's also Berserk, where you're giving a little piece of yourself to do more damage. You know, it's like savagery in a sense. So the analogy I think of when I think of Melee is that it's a pack of wild, hungry dogs that sprung up from hell and they're all coming straight at you. That's essentially the identity of what Melee is. It's savage, it's primal, it's evil, and it's abnormal. This is kind of unique when it comes to Melee and RuneScape because it's kind of like the complete opposite when compared to traditional portrayals of Melee. In traditional portrayals, you have the knight in white and shining armor coming to save the day. You know, they're the hero. This is something that is unique to RuneScape, where it's not just Melee but the other combat styles as well, where Jagex has taken them into a different approach. Finally, here are some ideas and suggestions for future Melee equipment. Now you might be thinking, we already have tier 95 armor and weapons, what could they possibly add more to Melee? With how clunky the style is and all the issues surrounding it, I wouldn't be surprised if more Melee equipment was released. And one idea I wanted to talk about is with the weapons. I think there's a huge room for thematic appropriate weapons that could end up having interesting mechanics as well. And the idea is to add living flesh weapons. You know, weapons that are alive. This falls into that overarching thing of Melee, which is abnormality. And we're not just talking about any old regular flesh weapons that, you know, there's a specific type of living weapon that we've already seen exist in RuneScape. Can you guess what it is?
Pokemon!
If you guessed the Stalkers, then you are right. Go check out the homies Let's Discuss RS's video covering the Stalkers to learn more about their lore. The Stalkers are strange demons that aren't native to Gielinor, but also, they are excellent fighters. In the lore, they originate from the moon of Infernus known as Ocularis, which is just a giant stalker. So the moon of the demon plains, it's a giant eyeball. Now the thing you need to know about Stalkers is that they love knowledge. They're a hive mind and they send out a bunch of stalkers across the universe to learn. Now the main stalker, Ocularis, it watched Zamorak lead the Avernic Revolution, which lasted 19 years on Infernus. So collectively, the Stalkers have like over 19 years of combat knowledge, which includes watching Zamorak and demons fighting. Like, you don't get more peak than that. Additionally, we've also seen Stalkers attach themselves to equipment. In the case of the Dungeoneering boss Ramernot, he was completely normal. Until, you know, his body was brought down to the warp floors of Daemonheim. You know, flesh merged with his equipment and there's a giant eyeball attached to his shield. Now, it wasn't specifically stated that the eyeball was a stalker, but it can be implied that it is. So, this is why flesh weapons, specifically weapons combined with stalkers, would fit perfectly thematically into Melee. They're demonic, they're abnormal, and they're incredibly strong. You look at Melee's ammo slot, what do you use? You use abyssal spikes. You know, parasites attached to metal spikes. And yeah, dude, like living demon weapons paired with the Vestimus of Havoc, like the concept goes crazy. Now, I'm only talking about like the aesthetics of it, because you know, demon and unholy war priest vestiments, they pair together perfectly. But you could probably also do some cool things with them mechanically. Say for example, you train with your stalker over time and you choose to train it to help you in a particular way. So for example, you train it to evade attacks, or you train it to deal more damage, or some other unique effect. Ever since Necromancy was released, there's just like been a whole door of opportunity of what combat could be, and stalker weapons would fit into that perfectly. So this was just me talking about the visual design of the combat style Melee. Let me know your thoughts, what you liked, what you didn't like, or if you have any other ideas of your own that you'd like to share. If you like this, feel free to drop a like, subscribe, and check out my other videos. I try to make different and unique RS content as much as I can, and I'll definitely be covering the other styles, talking about magic, range, and necromancy. Also, again, if you wanted to see any of my RuneScape art, then check out my socials linked in the description. My name is ACPL, and I'll be catching you guys in the next video.